Hey guys, and welcome to the DIY Fixers channel where we learn lots and lots of stuff the DIY style like professionals. If you have not subscribed yet to the channel, please go ahead and subscribe to get on board. And today we're going to learn how to solder the professional way, the right way, the safe way. Okay, so soldering is a great alternative to using this electrical insulating tape. It's a PVC material, so after some time it loses its stickiness, may start unraveling off your bundled wires, and that exposes you to the risk of suffering a serious electrical shock because the exposed wires are a serious electrical hazard. Okay, so this stuff is only good for temporary fixes, but if you want a good permanent fix on your electrical system, such as at home, in your car, you may want to solder the wires. It forms a permanent fix that allows smooth flow of current along the electrical wire. All right, so soldering is a relatively simple process. You only require basic accessories. You need a wire cutter or a pliers. You also need a wire stripper. This is a mechanical semi-automatic wire stripper. You may also go for the manual wire stripper, quite cheap, quite handy, does the job well, right? So you also need a good soldering wire. My case, I prefer using the rosin activated core wire, right? It's a 60-40 alloy, 1 mm in diameter, does a perfect job in attaching the wires, preventing rusting, and ensuring a smooth flow of current along your soldered wires, right? So that's a good thing. Okay, so I'm going to show you guys also how to use a heat shrink tubing. Does a good job in protecting your soldered wires, right, from exposure to heat, from exposure to rust, moisture, rain, accidental exposure to the risk of suffering an electrical shock. Okay, all right, so I'm going to show you guys how to solder 4 different types of wires. This is the smallest kind of a wire that I think ever exists in electrical systems. It's commonly used in electrical instruments such as your home theater. It's also used in chargers and so on and so forth. So I'm going to show you guys how to do it perfectly. It's a stranded type of a wire, comprises of different strands. Not sure whether you can see that. Okay, so soldering that requires a special attention so as not to melt the wires. Right, so the other type of wire is a thin stranded wire, which is also bundled. This wire is also quite similar to this one, but of a relatively higher gauge. Okay, so I'm going to show you guys how to solder it and how to apply a heat shrink tubing to protect each individual strand, as well as protect the entire bundle of strands after soldering. All right, so I'm also going to show you guys how to solder this relatively larger gauge of a wire, commonly used in electrical instruments, speakers, lightweight home electrical connections, and so on and so forth. Okay, so lastly, I'm going to use this bundled 3-core type of wire comprising of earth, neutral, and live wire bundled in one strand of a wire. Okay, so this wire is commonly used in home electrical connections as well as electrical extension cables. Right, so I'm going to show you guys how to solder it. Right, it's also bundled but comprised of a larger gauge of individual strands, which are bundled together in one individual strand, and 3 of those strands comprise of one electrical current carrying unit. Lastly, we need a good soldering iron. In my case, I'm using this 220 volt 60 watt soldering iron, which allows temperature adjustability. You can crank the heat all the way up to 450 degrees Celsius, as well as low as 200 degrees Celsius. So I'm going to show you guys how to use this solder effectively, safely, and how to ensure that you prevent common hazards such as accidentally touching this tip, which is quite hot. Right, oh, that burned me. Right, so the first thing to do is to make sure that your soldering iron is connected to the mains. Right, mine is connected. This is an AC unit. Then position it correctly on this soldering iron holder. Right, that prevents the unit from coming in contact with your soldering surface or any material. A slight touch of the soldering unit in its hot profile can cause serious burns on your surface, can cause fires, can cause bodily injury. So position it correctly on your table, relatively away from your working surface. Okay, right, so the next step is for you to pick the actual wire that you wish to solder. For my case, I'm going to start with this thin strand of a wire. The next step is to insert a heat shrink tubing, an appropriately sized heat shrink tubing, before you start the soldering process. All right, so for my case, I'm going to use this uniform diameter 1.0 profile heat shrink tubing. Okay, so there are different colors: green, red, yellow, and black. I strongly recommend going per the color coding of the wire that you're soldering. For my case, it's red color, so I'm going to pick a red heat shrink tubing and slide it in place on one of the wires, right? Slide it all the way along and past the terminal that you wish to solder. Okay, so once that is in, go ahead and de-insulate your wire or remove the insulation using an appropriate de-insulation tool. In my case, I'm going to use this semi-automatic mechanical wire stripper, right? So to do that, just position the wire correctly, a relatively long distance from the terminal, right? About 2 inches or 2.5 inches, okay? And strip the wire just like that. Then pull the insulation all the way out. Go ahead and repeat the process for the other wire that you wish to solder. And pull the insulation all the way out. So that exposes the two terminals that you wish to join together. So to start the soldering process, intertwine the wires all the way until 3/4 past the terminals, okay? Then try to twist the wires together as much as possible. That gives you a relatively firm fix, ensuring that the wire strands can come in perfect contact with each other and ensures a smooth flow of electric current. Okay, so my wires are relatively intertwined perfectly. So position the wires on a flat surface. If you have a soldering clips, you can clip the wires on either side so as to have a nicely perfect kind of orientation, so that you can introduce the heat and introduce the solder on opposite sides of the wires for a perfect soldering process. For my case, I'm going to show you a relatively simple process. I didn't succeed in finding soldering clips to hold my wires, but that's fine. This is a DIY channel, we can improvise, right? So go ahead and introduce the heat on the bottom side of the wires, right? And introduce the solder on the opposite side, on the upper side. So repeat the process on all sides to ensure that each part of the exposed wires gets a sufficient amount of solder. You can see it's relatively simple, easy to do, and there you have it, a firm fix, right? So the next step is to slide your heat shrink tubing all the way past the insulation to the exposed wires, okay? Slide it all the way through, and that covers the soldered surface perfectly. So the next step is to introduce some form of heat. You can use a heat gun or any source of, relatively high temperature heat. And there you have it. That's how you solder a good wire like this one. You're guaranteed the wire is going to last for a long time. It's not going to rust, and it's going to do the job just fine. So the next kind of wire that I'm going to demonstrate how to solder is this relatively large gauge of a wire, right? All right, so just like that. And what that does is that it ensures a good contact between the two wires that you're soldering, so that after you introduce the solder, the wires can continue, conducting electricity just like before. Okay, so go ahead and repeat the process like I showed you before. All right, so as you can see, the wires have been perfectly bonded together. And there you have it. So the next kind of wire that I'm going to demonstrate how to solder is this bundled wire, the one that has multiple strands in an individual band of a wire, and then two wires are bundled together, and then the process repeats for the other strand. Okay, so the only difference between this and this type of wire is that you have to introduce a heat shrink tubing on each individual strand of a wire to protect the wires from accidentally coming in contact with each other to cause a short circuit. All right, so the last type of wire that I'm going to show you guys how to solder is this 3-ply bundled wire. Go ahead and strip a relatively large chunk of the wire, about 3 inches or so. So after you've stripped your wires and inserted the corresponding heat shrink tubing on each of the individual strands as well as on the larger outer strand, go ahead and attach the wires to the corresponding wire on the opposite terminal. Red for red, yellow for yellow, blue for blue. Right, guys, so if you do it correctly, you're going to have a uniform strand like this one where each individual wire has been soldered to the other opposite correct terminal. Right, and the heat shrink tubing is slide all the way past the insulation to cover the exposed wires. Right, so as you can see, the individual strands are now firmly bonded. The heat shrink tubing protects each individual exposed wire strand, protecting the wires from corrosion and from the risk of an electric shock, as well as protecting the individual strands of wires carrying current from coming in contact with each other to form a short circuit. Right, go ahead and slide the larger heat shrink tubing along the individual strands of wires to protect them and ensure that they are bundled in place and they have the strength to withstand any form of external force. Right, so just like that, and the wires are now protected. The heat shrink tubing covers all the individual strands. So go ahead and introduce some external heat to shrink the heat shrink tubing and protect the wires as a bundle. All right, and there you have it. The wire is now strong, firmly fixed. The wires are protected from the elements, from heat, from water, from any form of damage, from short circuit, from electrocution. And there you have it, guys. I've shown you guys how to solder 3 types of wires, each individual wire requiring an individual technique. The wires are strong, they are not coming apart, they are well protected. They are not going to be exposed to, rusting or any form of, water-based damage. All right, so go ahead and subscribe to the channel. I'll be sure to do lots more videos, lots more of DIY fixing cars is coming up. So go ahead and subscribe, and if you have any comments, leave them in the comment section below. I'll be sure to reply to each one of them. And there you go.